The scent of untouched lobster bisque hung heavy in the penthouse air, metallic and wrong, like expensive perfume left too long in sunlight. Caroline Bennett's fingers trembled against the silk bedsheets as another world-renowned chef packed his knives in defeat, the sound of cutlery clicking against leather echoing through rooms that had grown too quiet, too empty. Her father's desperate voice carried from the hallway, pleading with someone on the phone about another specialist, another miracle worker, while Caroline's ribs pressed sharper against her nightgown with each passing day. Sebastian Bennett had built an empire on knowing exactly what people wanted and how much it would cost to get it. But his daughter's grief had proven immune to his usual solutions. 3 months since Esperanza's funeral, and Caroline had barely touched a morsel from the parade of celebrity chefs who'd tried to tempt her with their elaborate creations. The Michelin-starred offerings sat untouched on silver trays, growing cold while Caroline stared past them toward the window, watching the city below continue its relentless motion as if the world hadn't stopped the day her mother died. The intercom buzzed, and Remedios's weathered voice announced another arrival. "Senor Bennett, there's a young woman here about the cooking position." Sebastian's heavy footsteps approached Caroline's bedroom door. She didn't turn from the window when he entered, though she could feel his presence like a weight settling on her shoulders. The smell of his cologne mixed with the lingering aroma of failed meals, creating an atmosphere thick with disappointment and growing desperation. "Mija, there's someone new I want you to meet," he said, his voice carefully controlled, despite the tremor she could detect beneath. "Her name is Elizabeth. She's different from the others." Caroline's reflection in the window glass looked like a ghost of herself, all sharp angles and hollow spaces where softness used to live. She'd heard this promise before, had watched her father's hope crumble with each chef who'd left in frustration or defeat. The sound of new footsteps in the hallway made her muscles tense, preparing for another performance of polite refusal. But when Elizabeth Turner entered the room, something shifted in the air itself. She carried no gleaming knife roll, wore no pristine white coat. Instead, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned cooking not in culinary school, but at her grandmother's elbow, her calloused hands speaking of years spent coaxing flavor from simple ingredients. The warmth radiating from her presence seemed to chase away some of the chill that had settled permanently in Caroline's bones. "Hello, Caroline," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying the soft drawl of rural roots. "I brought something I thought you might like to smell at least." The clay pot in Elizabeth's hands released steam that curled upward like incense, carrying, with it, a fragrance that made Caroline's breath catch in her throat. Not the complex symphony of haute cuisine, but something deeper, more fundamental. The rich earthiness of chocolate ground by hand on stone, the gentle sweetness of cinnamon bark, the comforting warmth of milk heated slowly with patience and love. Caroline turned from the window for the first time in days, her nostrils flaring as the scent triggered something buried deep in her memory. The aroma wrapped around her like her mother's arms once had, during those childhood moments when the world felt too big and frightening, when only Esperanza's kitchen could make everything right again. "What is that?" Caroline whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Atole de chocolat," Elizabeth replied, settling the pot on the bedside table with careful reverence. "Made the old way, like my abuela taught me. She used to say that when the heart is too sad to eat, sometimes it needs to remember what love tastes like first." The steam continued rising, and with it came memories Caroline had locked away to protect herself from their pain. Sunday mornings when Esperanza would wake before dawn to prepare this exact drink, grinding the cacao beans on her beloved metate while humming lullabies in Spanish. The way her mother's hands moved with practiced grace, measuring ingredients not by cups, but by generations of inherited knowledge. The sound of the wooden molinillo frothing the mixture, creating tiny bubbles that would tickle Caroline's nose when she leaned too close. "My mother used to make this," Caroline said, the words scraping against her throat like broken glass. "Every Sunday morning, she'd call it liquid gold from the gods." Elizabeth nodded, understanding flickering in her dark eyes. The Aztecs believed chocolate was a gift from the gods, meant to comfort the human heart. Your mother sounds like she understood that. For the first time since the funeral, Caroline felt something other than the crushing weight of loss. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the faintest whisper of hunger. Her stomach, which had rejected every elaborate creation placed before it, gave the softest rumble as the familiar aroma filled her senses. "Would you like to try just a sip?" Elizabeth asked, ladling the thick, fragrant liquid into a small clay mug. "No pressure. Sometimes our bodies remember what our minds try to forget." Caroline's hands shook as she accepted the warm cup, its rough texture so different from the fine china that usually appeared at her bedside. The heat seeped through the clay into her palms, the first real warmth she'd felt in months. She raised it to her lips, hesitating as memories threatened to overwhelm her defenses. The first taste exploded across her tongue like coming home. Not just the flavor, though the chocolate was rich and pure, the cinnamon perfectly balanced, but the sensation of being 5 years old again, safe in her mother's kitchen while rain drummed against the windows. The exact ratio of sweetness to earthiness, the particular way the texture clung to her tongue, the gentle heat that warmed her from the inside out. Tears began streaming down Caroline's face before she realized she was crying. Great heaving sobs that shook her thin frame as she continued sipping the atole. Each swallow carried her deeper into the memory, until she could almost hear Esperanza's voice singing softly in Spanish, could almost feel her mother's hand stroking her hair. "This tastes exactly like hers," Caroline gasped between sobs, clutching the mug to her chest. "Exactly like my mother's. How is that possible?" Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed, her presence steady and unobtrusive. "Sometimes the old recipes find their way to where they're needed most. Your mother must have learned it the traditional way, just like I did." Sebastian appeared in the doorway, his face streaked with tears as he watched his daughter consume her first willing bite of food in months. The sight of Caroline cradling the simple clay mug, her eyes bright with tears and memory instead of the vacant stare that had haunted him for weeks, made his knees nearly buckle with relief. "She's eating," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. Caroline finished the entire mug, licking the last traces of chocolate from her lips with an instinctive pleasure that reminded everyone in the room of the vibrant young woman she'd been before grief had carved her hollow. Color had already begun returning to her cheeks, and her posture had straightened with the first stirrings of renewed life. "How did you know?" Caroline asked Elizabeth, her voice stronger now. "How did you know this would work when nothing else did?" Elizabeth smiled, her eyes holding depths of understanding that spoke of her own encounters with loss and healing. "Because food isn't just about nutrition, it's about memory, about connection, about the love that gets stirred into every pot. Your mother's love for you didn't disappear when she died. It just needed the right key to unlock it." The afternoon light streaming through the penthouse windows seemed different now, warmer and more golden, as if the sun itself had been waiting for this moment to truly shine. Caroline set down the empty mug and looked at Elizabeth with new curiosity, seeing not just another chef but a kindred spirit who understood the profound power of food to heal wounds that medicine couldn't touch. "Will you teach me?" Caroline asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will you show me how to make it the way she did?" Elizabeth's smile widened and she nodded slowly. "I'd be honored to. But first, you need to build up your strength. One sip at a time, one meal at a time." As Sebastian watched his daughter engage with another person for the first time in months, he felt something shift inside his chest. This wasn't just about Caroline eating again, though that miracle alone was worth more than all his wealth. This was about something deeper, something that had been missing from their lives long before Esperanza's death. A connection to their roots, to the traditions that had somehow gotten lost in the pursuit of success and status. For the first time in months, Caroline felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. The atole had done more than nourish her body. It had awakened memories she'd thought too painful to bear, and somehow made them bearable again. The taste of her mother's love, filtered through Elizabeth's patient hands, had shown her that grief and love could coexist, that honoring her mother's memory didn't have to mean drowning in sorrow. But as the initial wave of emotion subsided, new questions began forming in Caroline's mind. Who was this woman who had succeeded where world-renowned chefs had failed? How had she learned recipes that seemed to carry such specific power? And what other secrets might she hold about the healing properties of traditional foods? The setting sun painted the penthouse walls in shades of amber and gold, and Caroline realized she was actually looking forward to tomorrow for the first time since her mother's funeral. There was so much she wanted to learn, so much about her heritage that she'd never bothered to understand while Esperanza was alive to bridge that gap. Elizabeth began packing her simple cooking supplies, moving with the same quiet efficiency that had marked her entire visit. "I'll come back tomorrow, if you'd like. Maybe we can try something a little more substantial." "Yes," Caroline said immediately, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Please, I want to learn everything." As Elizabeth prepared to leave, Caroline caught her arm gently. "That recipe," she said, her eyes intense with newfound purpose. "Did you learn it from your grandmother?" "I did," Elizabeth replied, her voice soft with memory. "She taught me that every dish tells a story, carries the love of everyone who made it before us." Caroline nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. But as Elizabeth moved toward the door, Caroline felt a sudden urgency, as if there were crucial questions she hadn't yet thought to ask. The taste of the atole lingered on her tongue, familiar yet somehow holding mysteries she needed to unravel. "Elizabeth," she called out, her voice carrying a new note of determination. "Tomorrow, I want you to tell me everything. About your grandmother, about where these recipes really come from, about—" But Elizabeth had paused in the doorway, her expression suddenly distant, as if she were listening to something Caroline couldn't hear. The golden light from the hallway caught her face, revealing something in her eyes that looked almost like recognition, or perhaps remembrance of something long buried. "There's something I haven't told you," Elizabeth said quietly, her hand resting on the doorframe. "About why I really came here, about what my grandmother told me before she died. She said I would know when I found—" Elizabeth's words hung in the air like smoke from copal incense, thick with unspoken meaning. Caroline sat straighter in bed, her newly awakened appetite for life extending beyond food to encompass answers, truth, connection. The dying light cast long shadows across the room, and somewhere in those shadows, Caroline felt her mother's presence stirring. "Found what?" Caroline pressed, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Elizabeth turned back into the room, her weathered hands clasping and unclasping, as if trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. "My abuela, she had these dreams, vivid ones. She'd see faces of people she'd never met, taste recipes that weren't hers, hear voices calling from places she'd never been." Elizabeth's eyes found Caroline's, and in them was a depth of knowing that made Caroline's breath catch. "3 days before she died, she woke me at dawn, grabbed my hand so tight her knuckles went white, and told me about a girl with eyes like obsidian who would be starving for something more than food." The scent of chocolate still lingered in the room, but now it seemed to carry whispers, memories that belonged to someone else. Caroline's skin prickled with recognition, though she couldn't name what she was recognizing. "She described this room," Elizabeth continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The view of the city, the way the afternoon light hits that corner where your mother's photograph sits. She even knew about the metate. Caroline's gaze snapped to the corner Elizabeth indicated, where indeed her mother's favorite photo rested alongside the volcanic stone grinding tool that Esperanza had brought from Oaxaca as a young bride. The metate had sat unused for months, gathering dust like everything else that held too much memory. "That's impossible," Caroline breathed, but even as she spoke the words, she felt their falseness. Nothing felt impossible anymore. Not after tasting her mother's love in a cup of atole, made by a stranger's hands. Elizabeth approached the metate with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. Her fingers traced the ancient stone surface, worn smooth by generations of use. "Abuela told me the stones remember. Every hand that's worked them, every tear that's fallen on them, every prayer whispered over them. This one," she paused, her palm flat against the metate's surface. "This one has been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Caroline asked, though part of her already knew, had always known, was remembering something that felt both foreign and familiar. "To teach you what your mother never had the chance to." The room seemed to pulse with energy, and Caroline could swear she heard the faint sound of grinding, rhythmic and hypnotic, like a heartbeat made of stone and grain. She slipped from the bed, her bare feet silent on the cool marble floor, drawn to the metate as if by invisible threads. "My mother tried to teach me when I was younger," Caroline said, kneeling beside the stone. "I was always too busy, too interested in other things. I thought I'd have forever to learn." Elizabeth knelt beside her, and together they looked like supplicants before an altar. "She knew you'd learn when you were ready. Sometimes grief has to break us open before we can receive what we've always needed." The metate felt warm under Caroline's palms, impossibly warm for stone that had sat cold and unused for months. As her fingers explored its familiar curves, muscle memory she didn't know she possessed began stirring. Her hands found the mano, the stone roller, its weight familiar, despite years of neglect. "Show me," Caroline whispered. Elizabeth reached into her bag and withdrew a handful of dried cacao beans, their rich aroma immediately filling the space between them. "Your mother would have started here, with the beans. Each one selected by hand, roasted until the shells cracked just so." She placed the beans on the metate's surface, and Caroline's hands moved without conscious thought, beginning the slow, meditative process of grinding. The sound was exactly as she remembered from childhood mornings, a whispered prayer in stone and seed. "That's it," Elizabeth murmured, her voice blending with the rhythmic scraping. "Let the stone teach your hands. Let your mother's hands guide yours." As Caroline worked, tears streaming down her face, something profound began shifting inside her chest. Not just grief transforming into acceptance, but a deeper recognition of who she was meant to be. With each pass of the mano across stone, she felt herself connecting not just to her mother's memory, but to generations of women who had performed this same ritual, who had ground their love and intentions into every meal they prepared. The cacao began releasing its oils, filling the air with a fragrance so pure and intense, it seemed to transport them beyond the penthouse, beyond the city, to some primal place where food was medicine and cooking was ceremony. "I can feel her," Caroline whispered, her movements never faltering. "I can feel my mother's hands with mine." Elizabeth nodded, her own eyes bright with tears. "The ancestors don't leave us. They live in our hands, in our recipes, in every dish we make with love and intention." As the cacao transformed from beans to paste under Caroline's patient grinding, she began to understand that this was about more than healing from grief. This was about reclaiming something that had been lost, not just to her, but to her entire family. Somewhere in their pursuit of success and assimilation, They had let go of the very traditions that could have sustained them through life's darkest moments. Elizabeth, Caroline said, her voice strong despite the emotion threading through it. I want to learn everything, not just the recipes, but the stories behind them, the reasons they exist, the healing they can bring. That's a long road, Mija. It would mean leaving this comfortable world, going to places where the knowledge still lives, learning from women who've never left their villages but know more about nourishment than any chef with a Michelin star. Caroline looked up from the metate, her eyes blazing with newfound purpose. Then that's what I'll do. That's what I need to do. The golden paste on the stone seemed to pulse with life, and Caroline could swear she heard her mother's voice, soft and approving, carried on the wind that suddenly stirred the curtains despite the closed windows. Elizabeth smiled, and in that smile Caroline saw approval, encouragement, and something that looked like destiny recognizing itself. There's a place in Oaxaca, in the mountains near Tlaxiaco. The women there still know the old ways, still carry recipes that were old when the conquistadors arrived. My tia Esperanza lives there. Caroline's hands stilled on the mano. Your aunt's name is Esperanza? Was. She died last spring, but her daughter Luz carries on the tradition, and there are others. Women who would welcome you, who would see in you what I see, someone ready to become a bridge between the old ways and the new world. The possibility opened before Caroline like a door she hadn't known existed. Not just healing, but purpose. Not just recovery, but transformation into something she was meant to be. She looked around the penthouse, at all the luxury that had failed to comfort her in her darkest hour, and knew with startling clarity that her path led elsewhere. When can we go? She asked, her voice steady with determination. Elizabeth laughed, a sound like water over stones. First, you need to build your strength, learn to cook for yourself, to nourish your body and spirit. The journey to Oaxaca isn't just physical, it's a pilgrimage that requires preparation of the heart and soul. Over the following days, Caroline's penthouse kitchen transformed from a sterile showcase into a living workshop. Elizabeth arrived each morning with simple ingredients and infinite patience, guiding Caroline through the fundamental techniques that formed the foundation of traditional Mexican cooking. They ground chilies on the metate until Caroline's arms ached with good exhaustion. They made masa from scratch, Caroline's hands learning to feel when the consistency was perfect by touch alone. They prepared moles with dozens of ingredients, each one adding its voice to a symphony of flavor that Caroline began to understand was really a song of love. Sebastian watched from the sidelines, amazed by his daughter's transformation. The hollow-eyed wraith who had refused food for months was becoming a vibrant young woman with purpose burning in her eyes. Her laughter returned first in small bursts when Elizabeth shared stories of her grandmother's cooking disasters, then in fuller waves as Caroline began creating her own kitchen mishaps and triumphs. But it was when they made chiles en nogada together, the complex dish that celebrated Mexican independence with its colors of the flag, that Caroline's true awakening occurred. As she carefully peeled the charred poblano chiles, their smoky aroma filling her nostrils, she felt something click into place in her chest, like a key finding its lock. This is what I want to do, she announced, her voice ringing with certainty as she stuffed the chiles with fragrant picadillo. Not just cook, but preserve these traditions. Study them properly, document them, make sure they don't disappear. Elizabeth paused in her preparation of the walnut sauce, her face glowing with pride and something deeper. Recognition of a student surpassing expectations, of a calling finally answered. The university has a program in cultural anthropology, Caroline continued, her hands working steadily as her mind raced ahead. I could focus on culinary traditions, on the relationship between food and healing, between recipes and cultural identity. I could spend summers in Oaxaca, learning from the source. And winter's here, sharing what you've learned, Elizabeth added, understanding immediately. Building bridges between the traditional knowledge and the modern world that needs it. Caroline nodded, her entire being vibrating with possibility. The nogada sauce she was preparing seemed to glow with its own light, white and pure as fresh snow, dotted with ruby pomegranate seeds like drops of blood from a sacred ritual. This wasn't just dinner. It was communion, connection, calling. My mother would have loved this, Caroline said quietly, arranging the finished chilies on a platter with the care of someone creating art. She would have been so proud to see me finally understanding what she tried to teach me all those years. She is proud, Elizabeth replied with the certainty of someone who had learned to trust in things beyond the visible world. And she's still teaching you, through every recipe you master, every tradition you help preserve. That evening, as Caroline shared the chiles en nogada with her father, she saw him taste not just food, but hope, possibility, the return of the daughter he'd feared he'd lost forever. His eyes filled with tears as he took his first bite, and Caroline knew that this meal marked not just her recovery, but the beginning of something entirely new for their family. I want to go back to school, she told him between bites. I want to study our heritage, learn from the source, become someone who can preserve and share these traditions. Sebastian nodded, his throat too tight with emotion for immediate speech. When he finally found his voice, it was rough with unshed tears. Whatever you need, mija. Whatever it takes. As the days passed, Caroline's strength returned along with her sense of purpose. She devoured books on Mexican culinary history, reached out to professors who specialized in cultural preservation, began planning a curriculum that would combine academic study with hands-on learning from traditional cooks. Elizabeth became not just her teacher, but her partner, in designing a program that would honor the past while serving the future. But it was the growing certainty that their path led to Oaxaca that filled Caroline's dreams with images of mountain villages, ancient markets, and women whose hands carried knowledge older than written history. She could almost taste the air there, could almost hear the voices of the ancestors calling her home to a place she'd never been, but somehow knew was waiting for her. When do we leave? She asked Elizabeth one afternoon as they cleaned the metate together, their hands moving in harmony born of shared purpose. Elizabeth paused, her eyes distant with something that might have been concern or anticipation. Soon, mija. But first, there's something you need to understand about what we'll find there. The women who carry this knowledge, they don't share it lightly. They'll test you, challenge you, make sure you're worthy of what they've spent lifetimes protecting. Caroline felt a thrill of excitement mixed with nervousness. What kind of tests? Tests of the heart, of commitment, of understanding that this knowledge comes with responsibility. Once you receive it, you become its guardian, its voice in the world. It's not just about learning recipes, it's about accepting a sacred trust that will shape the rest of your life. The weight of that responsibility settled on Caroline's shoulders, but instead of feeling burdened, she felt empowered. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not just healing from grief, but a reason to be grateful for the pain that had broken her open enough to receive this calling. I'm ready, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Elizabeth smiled, but Caroline caught something in her expression, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even worry. The journey itself will change us both. Once we step onto that path, there's no going back to who we used to be. Good, Caroline replied without hesitation. I don't want to go back. I want to go forward, into whatever I'm meant to become. As they finished cleaning the kitchen, Caroline felt the future stretching before her like an open road. No longer the grieving daughter wasting away in a golden cage, but a young woman with purpose, with calling, with the strength to honor her mother's memory by becoming a bridge between worlds. The taste of possibility was sweet on her tongue, mixed with the lingering flavors of chocolate and chile, and for the first time since her mother's death, Caroline felt truly alive. But as Elizabeth gathered her things to leave, Caroline noticed her teacher's hands trembling slightly as she packed away the precious spices and tools that had become the instruments of Caroline's transformation. There was something Elizabeth wasn't saying, something about the journey ahead that carried weight beyond the obvious challenges of travel and study. "Elizabeth," Caroline said, catching her friend's arm gently, "is there something you're not telling me about Oaxaca? About what we'll find there?" Elizabeth's eyes met hers, and in them Caroline saw depths of knowledge and perhaps burden that she was only beginning to understand. "The women there, they knew your mother. Before she came to the city, before she married your father and left the mountains behind, they've been waiting for you to come home, Caroline. They've been waiting to pass on what should have been yours by birthright." The revelation hit Caroline like a physical blow, reorganizing everything she thought she knew about her family's history. "My mother never told me, because she thought she was protecting you from a life she'd chosen to leave behind. But the ancestors know better than we do about what's needed, when it's needed." Elizabeth's voice carried the weight of prophecy. "They sent me here not just to heal you, but to prepare you for what's coming. The responsibility you're about to inherit is bigger than you know." Caroline felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, but instead of fear, she experienced a deep sense of rightness, of puzzle pieces finally clicking into their proper places. "Then we go to them. We go to Oaxaca, and I learn what I was always meant to learn." Elizabeth nodded slowly, but her expression remained troubled. "Yes, we go. But Caroline, you need to understand. Once the matriarchs of Tlaxiaco accept you as one of their own, once they pass their knowledge to you, your life will never be your own again. You'll belong to the tradition, to the community, to something bigger than yourself. And there are those who won't." A sharp sound interrupted her words, the distinctive ring of Caroline's phone, piercing and urgent. But it wasn't the phone that made both women freeze. It was the sound beneath it, a low rumbling like distant thunder, like the earth itself shifting in preparation for something momentous. Through the penthouse windows, storm clouds were gathering with unnatural speed, though the weather forecast had promised clear skies. Elizabeth's face had gone pale, and her hands clutched at the small leather pouch she always wore around her neck. The one Caroline had never asked about, but had noticed contained something that made soft clicking sounds when Elizabeth moved quickly. "What is it?" Caroline demanded, understanding instinctively that this was no ordinary storm, no coincidental interruption. "They know," Elizabeth whispered, her eyes fixed on the darkening sky. "Somehow they know we're planning to go to Oaxaca, and if they're willing to reach this far, to show their hand this openly." The phone stopped ringing abruptly, leaving them in a silence that felt charged with electricity and possibility and threat. Caroline's newly awakened instincts screamed that they were standing at a crossroads, that the next few moments would determine not just their immediate future, but the entire trajectory of the path they'd chosen to walk together. "Who knows?" Caroline asked, though part of her was already understanding, already preparing for an answer that would change everything once again. Elizabeth's hand found Caroline's, gripping it with desperate intensity. "The ones who want the old knowledge to die with the old women, the ones who profit from keeping people disconnected from their roots, from their power to heal themselves." Her voice dropped to urgent whisper. "We have to leave tonight, Caroline. If we wait until morning—" But her words were lost in a crack of thunder so loud it shook the windows, followed immediately by a sound that made Caroline's blood freeze. Footsteps in the hallway, multiple sets, moving with the purposeful stride of people who had come to prevent something from happening. The storm outside might have been a coincidence, but those footsteps were not. Elizabeth was already moving, shoving essential items into her bag with practiced efficiency. "Pack light," Pack fast. Only what you can't replace. We leave through the service elevator in 3 minutes. Or we might not leave it. The apartment door burst open before Elizabeth could finish her sentence, and Caroline's world exploded into chaos. Not Sebastian's usual business associates or even security personnel, but strangers with cold eyes and expensive suits who moved through her home like they owned it. The leader, a woman with silver hair and predatory smile, surveyed the kitchen with obvious disdain, her gaze lingering on the metate with particular contempt. "Miss Bennett," the woman said, her voice smooth as poisoned honey. "I'm Victoria Harrington from the Cultural Preservation Initiative. We understand you've been receiving some questionable guidance about your heritage." Elizabeth stepped protectively in front of Caroline, her entire posture shifting from gentle teacher to fierce guardian. The leather pouch at her neck seemed to pulse with warmth, and Caroline caught the scent of copal, strong and protective, drifting from Elizabeth's skin. "There's nothing questionable about learning one's own traditions," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite the danger crackling in the air like electricity before lightning strikes. Victoria laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "Traditions. Is that what you call encouraging a grieving young woman to abandon her privileged life for primitive superstitions? We've been monitoring your influence on Miss Bennett, and frankly, we're concerned." The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows with supernatural fury. Caroline felt something ancient stirring in her blood, a recognition that this moment had been foretold, prepared for, by women whose names she didn't know, but whose strength she could feel flowing through her veins. "Who are you really?" Caroline demanded, stepping beside Elizabeth despite the fear clawing at her throat. "What do you want?" "We represent certain interests," Victoria replied smoothly, "who prefer that traditional knowledge remain safely contained in its proper context. Academic study is one thing, but this romantic notion of returning to your roots, of preserving dangerous practices that have no place in the modern world, that cannot be allowed." Elizabeth's hand found Caroline's, and through that touch, Caroline felt the strength of generations, the power of women who had ground corn by moonlight and stirred healing into every pot, who had preserved sacred knowledge through conquest and colonization and cultural assault. "The knowledge belongs to the people," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying authority that seemed to come from depths older than the city itself. "You cannot own it, cannot contain it, cannot stop its return to where it's needed." Victoria's smile turned predatory. "Watch us." The men with her moved forward, but as they did, something extraordinary happened. The matot on the counter began to hum, a low vibration that grew stronger with each step the intruders took. The clay pots Elizabeth had brought resonated in harmony, creating a sound like singing stones, like the earth itself awakening. Caroline felt the change in her body first, a warmth spreading from her chest outward, carried by blood that suddenly remembered its true heritage. Her hands began to move without conscious direction, reaching for the mano, gripping it like a weapon blessed by centuries of use. "You feel it now," Elizabeth whispered, her voice filled with awe and recognition, the awakening, the calling home. The storm outside reached crescendo just as Caroline understood what was happening. This wasn't just about her personal healing anymore. This was about something much larger, a battle for the soul of traditions that certain powers wanted dead and buried, versus the irrepressible force of ancestral knowledge seeking its rightful heirs. "We're going to Oaxaca," Caroline announced, her voice ringing with newfound power. "Tonight. Now. And you're not going to stop us." Victoria's face contorted with rage. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. The old ways are dead for good reason. The modern world has no place for primitive." "The old ways are alive," Caroline interrupted, and as she spoke, she could swear she heard other voices joining hers, her mother's, Elizabeth's grandmothers, countless women whose hands had worked stone and flame and healing herbs. They've always been alive, waiting for us to remember. Elizabeth was already moving toward the emergency stairs, her bag clutched tight. But Caroline hesitated for one crucial moment. On impulse, she grabbed the metate, cradling its ancient weight against her chest. The stone was warm as living, flesh, pulsing with energy that made her hands tingle. "Leave that primitive relic," Victoria snarled, but Caroline was already running, following Elizabeth toward whatever future awaited them beyond the penthouse walls. They burst through the emergency exit just as the storm reached its peak, rain driving horizontal in sheets that seemed designed to wash away everything false, everything imposed, everything that stood between Caroline and her true inheritance. The service elevator stood open like an invitation, and they dove inside just as pursuing footsteps echoed in the stairwell behind them. "Where are we going?" Caroline gasped, still clutching the matot as the elevator descended into the building's hidden depths. "To catch the last flight to Oaxaca," Elizabeth replied, her eyes bright with determination and something that looked like prophecy fulfilled. "My tia Luz is expecting us." "Your tia Luz is expecting us? But how could she know?" Elizabeth smiled, and in that smile Caroline saw depths of mystery she was only beginning to fathom. "Because she dreamed it, just like my abuela dreamed of finding you. The women in Tlaxiaco have been preparing for your arrival your whole life, Caroline. They've been grinding the corn and mixing the chocolate and keeping the copal burning, waiting for Esperanza's daughter to come home." The elevator opened onto the parking garage, where Elizabeth's battered truck waited like a faithful horse ready for the journey ahead. As they threw their belongings into the back, Caroline caught sight of their pursuers emerging from the building, Victoria's face twisted with fury as she spoke rapidly into her phone. "They'll follow us," Caroline said, her heart hammering as Elizabeth started the engine. "Let them try," Elizabeth replied grimly, pulling out of the garage into the storm-lashed streets. "They have money and influence, but we have something older and stronger. We have the protection of the ancestors and the certainty of women who know their true names." As they raced through the midnight streets toward the airport, Caroline held the metate against her chest and felt its ancient heartbeat synchronizing with her own. Behind them, the penthouse that had been her prison glowed with unnatural light, as if the very air inside was being cleansed of their presence. "Elizabeth," Caroline said as they navigated flooded streets that seemed to part before them like a sea recognizing its chosen travelers. "What happens when we get to Tlaxiaco? What waits for us there?" Elizabeth's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension or anticipation. The ceremony of acceptance. The formal passing of knowledge. The moment when you stop being Esperanza's grieving daughter and become who you were always meant to be. "And if I'm not ready? If I can't handle whatever they ask of me?" Elizabeth glanced at her, and in her eyes Caroline saw absolute faith, unshakable, certainty. "You'll be ready, mija. You were born for this moment. Your mother knew it. My abuela knew it. And now you're finally beginning to know it too." The airport loomed ahead through the driving rain, its lights wavering like candles in a cathedral. As they pulled into the departure zone, Caroline realized she was leaving behind everything she'd ever known for a future she couldn't fully imagine. But the matot in her arms felt warm with promise, and Elizabeth's presence beside her radiated the strength of women who had never forgotten their power. "Whatever happens in Oaxaca," Caroline said, as they gathered their belongings and prepared to step into the unknown, "we face it together." "Together," Elizabeth agreed, and sealed the promise with an embrace that felt like coming home to a family Caroline had never known she was missing. But as they hurried toward the terminal, Caroline caught sight of black sedans pulling up behind them, Victoria's pale face visible through rain-streaked windows. The battle for her soul, for her heritage, for her right to claim her true inheritance was far from over. The ancient knowledge called to her from across the mountains, from village squares where women still ground corn by hand and whispered prayers into every meal. But standing between Caroline and her destiny were forces that would stop at nothing to keep the old ways buried. The traditional knowledge contained the power of healing food locked away from those who needed it most. The matat pulsed against her chest like a second heart, and Caroline understood that she was carrying more than stone. She was carrying hope, carrying possibility, carrying the dreams of countless women who had preserved sacred knowledge through centuries of suppression and assault. The plane to Oaxaca was boarding, and Caroline Martinez Bennett, for that was her true name, she realized now, was finally going home to a place she'd never been, to claim an inheritance that had been waiting for her to be strong enough to receive it. Thunder rolled across the sky like the drums of the ancestors welcoming her to the dance, and Caroline stepped forward into her destiny, the matat warm in her arms and Elizabeth's wisdom lighting the path ahead. Caroline knelt in the dusty courtyard of Tlaxiaco as the sun painted the mountains gold and crimson, her hands trembling as they touched the ancient metate that had been carried from the village's heart to this sacred place. Around her, 7 women formed a circle, their faces marked by decades of carrying traditional knowledge, their hands scarred by stone and flame, and the honest work of feeding their people with love and intention. Tia Lu stepped forward, her weathered face glowing with tears and recognition, as she beheld Esperanza's daughter finally returned to claim her inheritance. The copal smoke rising from clay braziers carried prayers older than memory, and Caroline could feel her mother's presence as surely as she felt the warm stone beneath her palms. Esperanza told us you would come, Luce said, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had never left her mountains, but had seen the world's pain and healing in every pot she stirred. She said her daughter would return when the grief had broken her open enough to receive what love had prepared. The matat beneath Caroline's hand seemed to pulse with life, and she understood that this was the moment Elizabeth had been preparing her for, the ceremony that would transform her from student to guardian, from broken daughter to bridge between worlds. The village women began to chant in Zapotec, their voices weaving together like smoke and prayer and ancestral blessing. Place your hands where your mother's hands once rested, Luce instructed, guiding Caroline's fingers to worn grooves in the ancient stone. Feel the memory held in every curve, every smoothed surface. This matat ground the corn for your mother's first tamales, taught her the rhythm that would later comfort you as a child. Caroline's breath caught as her hands found the familiar depressions, and suddenly she could feel it all, her mother as a young woman, laughing as she learned to grind masa, tears of homesickness mixing with corn and water, dreams of a different life taking shape under her palms. The stone held it all, every emotion, every hope, every moment of connection between mother and daughter across time and distance. I accept the responsibility, Caroline whispered, her voice carrying across the courtyard like a vow that would reshape her life's trajectory. I accept the knowledge, the burden, the sacred trust of preservation. Elizabeth stood at the circle's edge, tears streaming down her face as she watched her student become something greater than either of them had imagined. The months of healing, of learning, of preparation, had led to this moment when Caroline would formally receive the inheritance that was hers by blood and calling. Luce lifted an ancient molcahet from the altar that had been prepared, its surface blackened by generations of use, its weight speaking of countless meals blessed by women's hands and intentions. This belonged to your bisabuela, your great-grandmother, who ground the chilies for mole that sustained whole villages during the Revolution. Her prayers are ground into this stone, her love seasoned into every dish it helped create. Caroline accepted the molcachete with shaking hands, understanding that she was receiving more than a cooking tool. This was a relic, a sacred object that connected her to a lineage of women who had fed bodies and souls, who had preserved culture and healing through the simple act of preparing food with reverence and love. The knowledge comes with obligations, another elder said, her voice sharp with the authority of someone who had seen traditions diluted and betrayed by those who claimed to honor them. You cannot take this lightly, cannot use it for personal gain or shallow purposes. This wisdom serves the community, serves the people who hunger for more than food. I understand, Caroline replied, and she did. Finally and completely. This wasn't about her own healing anymore, though healing had been necessary to prepare her. This was about becoming a vessel through which ancient knowledge could flow into a modern world that desperately needed the medicine of traditional foods, the comfort of recipes that carried love across generations. The ceremony continued as the sun moved across the sky, each woman sharing a piece of knowledge, a recipe, a technique that had been guarded and preserved through centuries of cultural assault. Caroline's hands learned the proper way to select chiles, the correct temperature for grinding chocolate, the prayers that blessed corn before it became masa. But more than techniques, she received understanding of food as medicine, of cooking as ceremony, of feeding others as the highest form of love. As the afternoon deepened toward evening, Caroline felt herself changing at a cellular level, becoming something she had always been meant to be, but had never had the courage or wisdom to claim. The grief that had nearly destroyed her had become the fertile ground from which this new self could grow, and she understood now that even her darkest moments had been necessary preparation for this transformation. There is one final test, Luce said, as the village women began preparing the evening meal together, their hands moving in harmony born of shared knowledge and mutual trust. You must prepare mole for the entire village, using only the knowledge you've received today, guided only by your hands and your heart, and the ancestors who speak through them. Caroline felt a moment of panic. How could she possibly prepare such a complex dish for so many people, using techniques she'd only just learned? But as her hands found the matat and began grinding the first chilies, the panic dissolved into certainty. Her mother's hands guided hers. Elizabeth's grandmother whispered instructions through the evening breeze, and countless unknown ancestors lent their strength to her movements. The mole came together like a prayer made manifest, each ingredient adding its voice to a symphony of flavor that spoke of love, tradition, community, healing. Caroline worked by firelight as the stars emerged, her hands moving with confidence she'd never possessed, her heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment of acceptance and transformation. When the mole was finished and served to the gathered villagers, the silence that followed the first taste was profound as communion. Then came the tears, the embraces, the recognition that Esperanza's daughter had indeed returned, carrying her mother's gift transformed by her own suffering into something even more powerful. You are home now, Luce said, embracing Caroline as the celebration continued around them. Not just to this place, but to yourself, to your true purpose, to the legacy that was always yours to claim. Elizabeth appeared at Caroline's side, her face radiant with pride and completion. My abuela's vision is fulfilled, she said softly. You are who she saw in her dreams, the bridge between worlds, the keeper of wisdom, the one who will carry the traditions forward into whatever future awaits. As the village settled into nighttime quiet, Caroline sat with the matat in her lap, feeling its weight not as burden but as anchor, grounding her in purpose and possibility. Tomorrow she would return to the outside world, but she would return transformed, carrying sacred knowledge and unshakable commitment to preserving and sharing the healing power of traditional foods. The stars above Tlaxiaco seemed to pulse with approval, and Caroline could swear she heard her mother's voice on the mountain wind, full of love and pride and the deep satisfaction of witnessing a daughter finally become who she was always meant to be. The grief that had broken her open had become the gateway to her true inheritance, And Carolyn understood now that every moment of pain had been necessary preparation for this moment of profound coming home. She was no longer the hollow-eyed girl who had refused to eat, no longer the privileged daughter wasting away in a golden cage. She was a guardian of traditional knowledge, a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern need. A woman whose hands carried the healing power of countless generations of mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers who had fed their people with love, made manifest in every meal. The matot hummed softly in her lap, warm with the energy of acceptance and the promise of all the healing meals yet to be prepared, all the traditions yet to be preserved, all the bridges yet to be built between the wisdom of the past and the hunger of the future. Carolyn closed her eyes and felt herself surrounded by the love of ancestors whose names she was only beginning to learn, whose recipes would now flow through her hands to nourish whoever needed feeding, whoever needed healing, whoever needed to remember that food is love made visible, and love, when prepared with sacred intention, can transform the deepest